I never thought a simple driveway could turn into a war zone. But when the HOA tried to block me in, they didn't see the court papers coming. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. I had just finished my cup of coffee and was ready to start the day. I checked my email, fed the dog, and then stepped out into the garage to head out. As I opened the garage door, I noticed something strange. A crisp white envelope was sticking out of my mailbox. It looked official, too official to be a simple advertisement. I took the letter and walked back inside. As soon as I saw the Pinecrest Homeowners Association HOA logo in the corner, my stomach dropped. The HOA and I had never seen eye to eye, but it had always been minor stuff I could ignore. Rules about how tall my grass could grow, when to take down the holiday lights, that sort of thing. But this time it felt different. This wasn't a letter about Christmas lights. This was something else entirely. I sat down at the kitchen table and tore open the envelope. Felt heavier than usual. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and started reading. The HOA's notice. Dear Mr. Mitchell, this notice serves as a formal warning regarding an unauthorized structure on your property. Specifically, your driveway access appears to violate the community's guidelines and must be adjusted within 30 days to avoid further action. If these modifications are not made, the HOA will pursue legal action to have your property brought into compliance. Please contact the HOA office to discuss a resolution. Sincerely, Pinecrest HOA Board. I looked up from the letter, my mind racing. Unauthorized structure? My driveway? I couldn't believe what I was reading. It's not like I had installed a massive shed or a pool that violated the rules. It was just a standard driveway, nothing unusual about it. I grabbed the phone and immediately called my neighbor Tom. He had lived in Pinecrest for years and was always in the loop on HOA matters. I needed someone to talk this through with. Hey, Tom, got a minute? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm always here. What's up? Tom replied. I just got this letter from the HOA saying that my driveway's some kind of violation. Do you know anything about this? There was a long pause on the other end. What? Your driveway? He asked, almost incredulously. That's ridiculous. You've had that driveway for as long as I've known you. That's what I thought. It's the same as it's always been, I said, pacing around the kitchen. I don't even know what they're talking about. Well, you know the HOA, they've been more aggressive lately. Judith Winters just became president a few months ago. Things have definitely been different since then. Tom's voice dropped lower, almost as if he was speaking in confidence. They're probably coming after you because they can. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about a driveway. It was about control. It was about the HOA flexing its muscles and using its power to dictate every small part of our lives. I had been living peacefully here for years, but it felt like the moment Judith Winters took over, the rules changed. She'd been pushing for more stringent rules, more fines, and more surveillance. It wasn't just the way she handled business, it was the way she enforced it. Over the past few months, neighbors had started complaining about receiving random fines for things like unapproved lawn decorations or slight imperfections in their fencing. It was like she was targeting anyone who dared step out of line, and now I was in her sights. Tom and I spoke for a few more minutes, brainstorming possible reasons behind the sudden attack on my driveway. But neither of us could come up with anything concrete. The whole thing didn't make sense. I had to act fast. This wasn't just an HOA complaint. It was a fight for my property, my rights, and the peace I'd fought so hard to establish in this neighborhood. I hung up the phone and stared at the letter again. It seemed so trivial, yet it felt like everything was on the line. The HOA wanted me to fix something that wasn't broken, and I wasn't about to let them dictate the rules without a fight. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I wasn't about to just take this lying down. I pulled up the HOA guidelines and started scanning through the rules related to driveways and property boundaries. I couldn't find anything that matched what they were accusing me of. Feeling more frustrated by the minute, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I printed out the relevant sections of the guidelines and started writing down my notes. I was going to need more than just words. I needed to take action, and that meant I would need to gather evidence to fight back. I wasn't going to let Judith or anyone else in the HOA push me around. But to win, I needed more than just a good argument. I needed the truth, and that truth would have to be backed by facts. I needed to know exactly what they were accusing me of and why. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the HOA had something up their sleeve. Something more than just a silly complaint about my driveway. They had already sent the letter, but I knew it wouldn't stop there. It wasn't like the HOA to be so passive about these things. This felt more like a warning shot, like they were testing how far they could push me before I folded. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. Every time I tried to go about my usual routine, the letter loomed in my mind. How could I fix this? What was I supposed to do? Was I going to have to tear up my entire driveway just to please them? I couldn't let it get to that point. I wouldn't. The next morning, I decided to pay a visit to my lawyer, Dylan. I'd known him since college. He had always been the guy who could find a way out of any mess. I trusted him, and I hoped he could help me get to the bottom of this. I walked into his office, a small, cluttered room filled with case files and law books. Dylan looked up from his desk as I entered, his face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, James, what's going on?" He gestured for me to sit. I dropped the HOA letter on his desk. "I need your help. The HOA's trying to block my driveway. They've given me 30 days to fix it, or they'll take legal action." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Block your driveway? That's a new one. What exactly are they saying about it?" I explained everything, the vague wording of the letter, the lack of any real explanation, and the general frustration I felt. Dylan nodded, listening carefully. "This doesn't sound like a legal issue at all. They can't just do that without a legitimate reason. Have you looked into their rules about driveways?" he asked, leaning forward. I shook my head. "I've read through the HOA guidelines. Nothing in there says anything about what they're claiming. It's a standard driveway." Dylan smiled, a little relieved. "Good. Sounds like they're just trying to bully you into compliance. Here's the thing. The HOA has certain powers, but they can't just change the rules on a whim or enforce things that aren't in the guidelines. You have the right to fight this." A wave of relief washed over me. "So, you're saying I don't have to tear up my driveway?" "No, not at all. In fact, you might have a case against them if they continue to harass you. If you want to take action, I can help you gather evidence, and we can look into whether they've been violating any of their own rules." Dylan pulled out a pad of paper and began jotting down notes. "The first thing we'll need is more information, whether this is part of a pattern of selective enforcement. We'll also need documentation of how they've been targeting you and other homeowners. If we can prove it's more than just a misunderstanding, you could be looking at a big case on your hands." I nodded slowly. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. This was about the principle of it, about standing up to people who thought they could control my life without any real reason. The more I thought about it, the more fired up I got. That afternoon, I spent hours poring over the HOA's rules and regulations. The more I looked, the more I realized that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I found a few mentions of driveway restrictions, mostly about the aesthetic look of the neighborhood and ensuring no unsightly vehicles were parked out front, but nothing that remotely applied to my case. I even looked into past violations. The more I dug, the more I realized that the HOA's decisions weren't always fair. They had a history of targeting certain homeowners, enforcing rules arbitrarily, and turning a blind eye to others who had the right connections. The more I discovered, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about my driveway. This was about a larger issue. The HOA had been playing favorites, and they were willing to push the boundaries of the law to get what they wanted. They couldn't just pick on me and expect me to roll over. They needed to be held accountable. I decided to talk to my neighbor, Maria, who had lived in the neighborhood for years. If anyone knew what was really going on, it was her. I went over to her house the next evening, and we sat in her kitchen, sipping coffee as I explained everything that had been happening with the HOA. "You're not the only one, James," Maria said, shaking her head. "The HOA has been getting more and more aggressive. They've been fining people for the smallest things. Some of my neighbors, people I've known for years, have had to pay ridiculous fines for things like trimming their trees or repainting their fences. Really? I asked, shocked. So, this isn't just about my driveway? They've been doing this to other people too. Maria nodded. Oh yeah. And the worst part is, if you try to stand up to them, they'll find a way to get back at you. A few months ago, they slapped a fine on Mr. Turner for something minor. His grass was a little too high. He fought it, and the next thing you know, his fence was declared out of compliance. I was beginning to see a pattern. This wasn't just about the rules. It was about control and manipulation. The HOA had a lot of power, and they were using it to bully residents into submission. And I wasn't the only one who had suffered because of it. I can't just let them get away with this, I said, my voice firm. If they want a fight, they're going to get one. Maria gave me a knowing look. You're not alone, James. We've all been scared to stand up to them. But if you push back, you might find that there are a lot of people in this neighborhood who are fed up too. I went home that night with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about my driveway. It was about fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been too afraid to speak up. If the HOA thought they could push me around, they had another thing coming. I reached out to my lawyer Dylan the next day. I'm ready to take them on. What do we need to do? Dylan smiled. Let's start by gathering evidence. We'll need to document everything, any letters they've sent you, all the fines, and any communication about your driveway. If we can prove this is part of a pattern, we'll have a solid case. I've already started taking notes on their past violations, I said. I'm also going to talk to more neighbors. I think there are more people who would be willing to stand up to them if they knew they weren't alone. That's the spirit, Dylan said. The more people you have on your side, the better. I woke up the next morning with a sense of urgency. I had a lot to do if I wanted to stand a chance against the HOA. Dylan had given me a solid plan, but I knew it would take everything I had to make this work. I couldn't just sit around and wait for them to strike. I had to be proactive, build a solid case, and gather all the evidence I could. The first thing I did was grab my laptop and start digging into the HOA's records. I went through old newsletters, meeting minutes, and even financial reports. There had to be something in there, something that showed the HOA's true motives. What I found was almost worse than I expected. The HOA had been quietly changing rules and procedures for years. They'd made decisions without proper votes, forced homeowners to follow unreasonable demands, and issued fines for the smallest of infractions. But what struck me the most was the selective enforcement. The HOA would turn a blind eye to the houses of residents they liked, while slapping fines on anyone who dared question their authority. I also started digging into the public records. The more I researched, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a driveway. This was about power, control, and money. The HOA was using its authority to intimidate and exploit residents for their own gain. By the time I got to work the next day, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. If I wanted to win, I would need to get more people on my side. I started talking to my neighbors about what I had uncovered. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of retribution from the HOA. But as soon as they heard what I had to say, they started opening up. Maria was the first one to speak up. James, I've been keeping track of everything for months. The fines, the threats, the ridiculous demands. You're not the only one they've targeted. What do you mean? I asked, leaning in. Maria looked around to make sure no one was listening. I've been documenting it all. I've got photos, emails, even recordings of meetings. I knew they were trying to push people around, but I didn't have the guts to do anything about it. But now I'm ready to fight. This was the breakthrough I needed. Maria wasn't alone. Several other neighbors had also been collecting evidence and were ready to join forces. That night, I met with Tom, Maria, and a few other neighbors who were fed up with the HOA's tactics. We gathered around Tom's kitchen table, a stack of papers, photos, and emails between us. The energy in the room was electric. Everyone was fired up, ready to take action. We spent hours strategizing. We talked about how to approach the HOA legally and how to expose their misconduct without giving them the ammunition to retaliate. We need to get everything documented, Dylan said when I called him that evening. I know it feels like we're up against the wall, but the law is on your side. Homeowners associations have to operate within their bylaws. If they don't, we have grounds for a lawsuit. I could hear the confidence in his voice, but I wasn't so sure. The HOA had a lot of power, and they weren't afraid to use it. But if Dylan thought we had a shot, I wasn't going to back down. Over the next week, more and more neighbors started coming forward. There was Mr. Turner, who had been slapped with a fine for unauthorized yard decorations after he put up a few Halloween decorations. He didn't mind paying the fine at first, but when the HOA told him to take down his decorations, on a holiday no less, he realized they were taking it too far. Then there was the Garcias, who had been fined for parking their RV on their own property. The HOA claimed it was a violation of property aesthetics, even though the RV was tucked away in their side yard and never in the way of anyone's view. The Garcias had been too scared to fight back, but now, seeing the support we were getting, they were ready to stand up too. Each story was a small piece of the puzzle, but together, they formed a picture of an HOA that was operating illegally, picking and choosing who to target and abusing their power. The more evidence we gathered, the more clear it became that this wasn't just about my driveway. This was about a corrupt system that needed to be taken down. It wasn't long before the HOA retaliated. One morning, I woke up to a letter on my doorstep, a second notice, this time threatening immediate legal action if I didn't comply with their demands. It wasn't just about my driveway anymore. They were coming after me with everything they had. I showed the letter to Maria and Tom that morning. "They've escalated it," I said, my voice tight with anger. "They think they can just walk all over me, but they're wrong." Maria's face was hard. "We're not letting them get away with this. We need to hit them where it hurts." That evening, we gathered in my living room, all the evidence spread out in front of us. We had the emails, the photos, the recordings, everything we needed. Now it was time to take the next step. "We need to go public," I said, looking around at the group. "We need to expose the HOA for what they really are. The more people who know what's going on, the harder it will be for them to cover it up." Tom nodded. "You're right. If we bring this to the media, it'll force the HOA to back down. They can't afford the bad press. Not with the way they've been operating." Maria added, "And we can't just rely on the courts. We need to make sure we're ready to go to the media if they try to intimidate us." I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about defending my driveway anymore. It was about taking down an oppressive system that had bullied and silenced residents for far too long. This was the beginning of something bigger. The next few days were a blur of activity. I spent every waking moment preparing for the battle ahead. Dylan had advised me to take a more aggressive stance with the HOA. We couldn't let them keep pushing us around. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then it was time for us to throw the first punch. We decided to file a formal complaint with the local government. We wanted to force the HOA to answer for their illegal actions. I knew the road ahead would be tough, but I also knew that if we didn't stand up now, we'd never get the chance to do it again. I called Maria and the others to get the ball rolling. "We need to make sure we have everything ready," I said over the phone. "This isn't just about my driveway anymore. It's about all of us. We need to expose what they've been doing to this community." Maria's voice came through the line, filled with determination. "You're right. This isn't just your fight. We all have a stake in this now." Tom added, "We're ready, James. Whatever it takes." I could feel the energy in the air. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one person. It was about the entire neighborhood. The fear that had kept us silent for so long was starting to fade. People were ready to fight for what was right. The following week, we gathered the final pieces of evidence we needed. Email trails, photographs, recordings, and the legal documents that proved the HOA had violated its own rules. Dylan and I worked late into the night, drafting our complaint and organizing everything into a neat, airtight case. "We've got them cornered," Dylan said, reviewing our work one last time. "They'll have no choice but to answer for this." When the complaint was filed, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had done everything I could. Now it was in the hands of the law. But I knew that the HOA wouldn't back down easily. If anything, this would only make them more desperate. I had a feeling they were already planning their next move. The following morning, As I opened my email, I saw a message from the HOA. I knew it wasn't going to be good. I clicked it open and began reading. Dear Mr. Mitchell, this is to inform you that the HOA board has voted to fine you an additional $5,000 for legal fees associated with your continued defiance of community rules. Your actions have been deemed disruptive, and the HOA is prepared to take further legal action. We strongly advise you to cease your attempts to undermine the authority of the board. Sincerely, Pinecrest HOA Board. I sat there staring at the email, seething. They were escalating this fight, trying to force me into submission. They thought they could intimidate me into backing down. But they were wrong. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood, about standing up to bullies who had taken advantage of us for too long. I forwarded the email to Dylan immediately. They're escalating. What do we do now? He replied almost instantly, we stay the course. They want to make you the example. Don't let them. The more I fought back, the more people started showing up to support me. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up for fear of retribution were now coming forward with their own stories of HOA overreach. Everyone had their own horror story. Mr. Turner's fine for Halloween decorations. The Garcias fight over the RV. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a systemic issue, and it needed to be addressed. Tom, Maria, and I decided to organize a meeting in the community garden that evening. We needed to get as many people as possible on board to fight back against the HOA. It wasn't just about my driveway, it was about our entire community standing up for our rights. By the time the meeting started, the community garden was packed. There were over 30 people gathered, and many of them had brought evidence of their own. Old emails, photos, and even testimonies from neighbors who had been too scared to speak up. I know this is scary, I began, my voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling in my chest. But we can't let them win. If we don't stand up now, we'll never get the chance to do it again. This isn't just about my driveway, it's about all of us. It's about the power the HOA has over our lives, and it's time to take that power back. That night, something shifted in the community. The fear that had held us back for so long began to dissipate. People started speaking up, sharing their experiences, their frustrations, and their anger. And the more they spoke, the more I realized that this fight wasn't just mine. It was ours. The next morning, I reached out to a local journalist I knew. I didn't want this to just stay in the courtroom. I needed the whole town to know what was going on. If the HOA thought they could get away with bullying us into submission, they had another thing coming. I've got a story for you, I said when the journalist answered, and I think it's one that needs to be told. A few days later, the local news picked up the story. The headline read, Local homeowners take on overreaching HOA in court battle. The article detailed our fight against the HOA, including the complaints we had filed, the evidence we had gathered, and the stories from other neighbors who had been bullied by the board. The HOA's public relations team was quick to respond, of course. They issued a statement claiming that they were simply enforcing the community guidelines and ensuring that Pinecrest remained a desirable place to live. But the damage had already been done. The public was on our side now. A few weeks later, we found ourselves in court. It wasn't just me fighting this battle anymore. It was the whole neighborhood. We had gathered enough evidence to not only challenge the HOA's accusations against me, but to expose their broader pattern of misconduct. Dylan stood by my side, ready to defend me in front of the judge. The HOA's lawyer, a slick, fast-talking professional, tried to paint me as the villain, the rogue homeowner who was causing trouble. But with every piece of evidence we presented, the tide began to turn. The turning point came when I was able to present the footage of the HOA board members meeting in secret, planning their retaliation. It was a smoking gun, and it changed everything. The judge looked at the evidence, then at the HOA's lawyer, and made a simple but powerful statement. The court finds in favor of Mr. Mitchell, the judge said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. The HOA is ordered to cease its harassment and pay Mr. Mitchell's legal fees. The courtroom was packed. Couldn't believe it. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up for years were sitting in the gallery, watching as this battle between the HOA and us played out. Tom, Maria, and a few others were there for moral support. But this was more than just a courtroom drama. This was our chance to take back control, not just of my driveway, but of our entire community. The HOA's lawyer stood up first, all polished and sharp in his suit, ready to make his case. I could see the smirk on his face. He thought this would be easy. After all, it was just one homeowner against a powerful HOA. But he hadn't counted on us. Dylan, my lawyer, stood beside me, calm and collected. He knew we had them. The evidence was on our side. The judge had already seen our complaint, and now it was time for the HOA to answer for their actions. I watched as Dylan made his opening argument. He laid out the facts, how the HOA had acted outside their own rules, how they had targeted certain homeowners with fines and threats, and how they had tried to intimidate me with unreasonable demands to block my driveway. The judge listened intently, his face unreadable, but I could tell he was processing every word. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and looked around the courtroom. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to do this. I had to tell the truth. I moved to Pinecrest because I wanted to live in a peaceful community. I began. But that peace was shattered the moment the HOA decided that my driveway, my personal property, wasn't good enough. I spent weeks fighting this, gathering evidence, and speaking with my neighbors. And what I've found is more than just a simple misunderstanding. The HOA has been using its power to intimidate and control, to enforce rules that don't exist and punish people for things that aren't even violations. I could see the judge nodding. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a fight for justice, for fairness, for the very integrity of our neighborhood. The HOA's lawyer tried to counter my statements, but it was clear that their case was falling apart. Every time he tried to deny what we had presented, we had another piece of evidence to back it up. The recordings, the emails, the testimony from neighbors who had been pushed around by the HOA, it was all there, and it was undeniable. But then came the final blow. The moment I had been waiting for, the moment that would turn the tide in our favor. Dylan stood up and introduced the final piece of evidence. The video footage from the HOA's secret meeting. The video clearly showed the board members, including Judith Winters, discussing how they could target residents like me for violating vague rules in order to make money through landscaping contracts and fines. The footage was crystal clear, and the room fell silent as it played. The judge's face hardened as he watched, and the color drained from the HOA lawyer's face. It was over. The proof was there. The judge took his time deliberating, but it was clear to everyone in the room what was going to happen. When he finally spoke, his words were firm and decisive. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds in favor of Mr. Mitchell. The HOA is ordered to cease all actions against him regarding his driveway and any other violations they have wrongfully accused him of. The HOA is further ordered to pay Mr. Mitchell's legal fees and any additional damages resulting from their actions. The room erupted into applause. I felt my knees go weak, and I had to sit back down in my chair. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone in Pinecrest who had been silenced, bullied, and forced into submission by the HOA. As I left the courthouse that day, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The HOA had lost. Not just me, but the entire neighborhood had won. The power dynamics in Pinecrest Gardens had shifted, and the old guard was being forced out. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The HOA board members who had orchestrated the harassment were removed from their positions. The community rallied together to vote in new, fair leadership that actually cared about the well-being of the residents, not their own pockets. I spent the next few months watching Pinecrest Gardens transform. The neighborhood that had once been divided, filled with fear and mistrust, began to heal. People started talking again, sharing stories and helping each other out. It felt like the community I had originally moved into, the one I had hoped for all along. The new HOA board, made up of homeowners who truly cared, began making decisions that benefited everyone. They put in place rules that were fair, transparent, and in the best interest of the residents. No more petty fines for minor infractions. No more random inspections to punish homeowners for trivial things. It was a new day for Pinecrest Gardens. As for my driveway, the HOA officially backed down. My driveway stayed exactly where it was, and I was no longer under threat. But it was more than just the driveway. I had won back my sense of security, my peace of mind, and my place in this community. Looking back on everything that had happened, I couldn't help but feel proud. I had started out just trying to keep my driveway, but in the end, it was about so much more. It was about standing up for what's right. It was about fighting for a community that had been abused by those in power for far too long. I had changed too. I wasn't the same person who had gotten that letter in the mail months ago. I had fought for what was mine, and in doing so, I had helped others find their courage as well. I had become a leader in my community, not because I wanted power, but because I wanted fairness. And that was something worth fighting for. As I walked through Pinecrest Gardens that spring, the neighborhood felt different. The lawns were vibrant again, people were talking to each other on their porches, and there was a sense of hope in the air. The poison that had once seeped into our community, the fear, the intimidation, had been washed away by the courage of those who stood up. I looked around at the people who had come together to make this change happen. Maria, Tom, Mr. Turner, the Garcias. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were my friends. We had all been through something together, and it had made us stronger. The HOA may have tried to block my driveway, but in the end, they didn't see the court papers coming. And that made all the difference. As I sat on my front porch, sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise over Pinecrest Gardens, I thought about everything we had been through. The fight wasn't easy, but it had been worth it. Sometimes you have to stand up to the bullies, even when the odds seem stacked against you. And when you do, you might just change the world around you. The war was over, but the battle had taught me something I would never forget. One person standing up can spark a fire that can burn down even the strongest walls of oppression.